He drove her car. He saved her life. And she never saw it coming. Boom. He found the tracker on a Tuesday. A small black device, no bigger than a matchbook, magnetic mounted to the underside of the rear axle housing, positioned where a routine inspection would never reach it. Mason Rourke crouched in the parking garage with grease on his knuckles and a feeling in his chest he hadn't felt in 11 years. Not fear, something older than fear, recognition. Someone had been watching Vivienne Carrington for a long time, and they had been doing it right under the nose of a 12-person security detail that didn't know what it was looking at. Mason carefully photographed the device without touching it, stood up, wiped his hands on a shop rag, and looked around the empty garage. Concrete pillars. Fluorescent light humming overhead. A security camera in the far corner, its red indicator light blinking steadily. He had 48 hours before the gala. He already knew nobody was going to listen to him. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Drop a like if you're already hooked, and tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's get back to Mason Rourke and the night that changed everything. The thing about being invisible is that most people work very hard to achieve it and never quite get there. Mason Rourke achieved it by accident, or maybe by intention, depending on how honest he was being with himself at any given moment. He was 37 years old, medium height, with the kind of build that suggested physical capability without advertising it. Brown hair cut short, not military short anymore, but close enough that people who'd served would notice. Quiet hands. The habit of sitting with his back to walls. He drove a black armored Cadillac Escalade for a living, and he was good at it. That was all anyone at Carrington Meridian Group seemed to want to know about him. He showed up at 6:45 every morning, had the vehicle warmed and inspected before Vivienne Carrington descended from her penthouse suite, and spent the rest of his day navigating her between offices, board meetings, investor lunches, and the kind of engagements that required a CEO to be seen in the right places at the right times. He was punctual, reliable, and professionally invisible, which, in the world of executive protection and corporate transport, was considered the highest possible compliment. It was also, Mason had come to understand, a serious vulnerability. Nobody noticed the driver. Nobody watched the driver. Nobody questioned why the driver occasionally lingered near loading bays, or why he sometimes walked the perimeter of a venue before Vivienne arrived, or why he kept a worn spiral notebook in the center console filled with handwritten observations he never showed anyone. Nobody paid attention to drivers. That was the point. Mason had come to Carrington Meridian 18 months ago at the quiet request of a man who was already dying. Arthur Carrington, Vivienne's father, founder of the company, a man who had built a mid-sized financial consultancy into a billion-dollar corporate group through 40 years of grinding, stubborn work, had reached out through a chain of intermediaries that took 3 separate referrals to navigate. Mason had been doing contract security consulting at the time, nothing glamorous, mostly risk assessments for mid-level executives who'd received vague threats. It paid the bills. It kept his schedule flexible enough that he could be home when Haley needed him. He'd agreed to meet Arthur at a private medical facility in Connecticut, expecting a straightforward conversation about corporate security protocols. What he got instead was an old man sitting in a recliner with an IV line in his arm, a folder of documents on his lap, and eyes that were still sharp as a hawk's, even as everything else was failing. "I know who you are," Arthur had said, before Mason even sat down. "Not the resume version, the real one." Mason had waited. "You spent 11 years doing things most people will never know happened. You left because your wife got sick and you wanted to be home for your daughter." Arthur paused to breathe. Even that took effort. "I'm not going to pretend that wasn't a sacrifice, but I need someone with your specific background, in a specific position, for a specific reason." "What reason?" "I think someone inside my company is building something I can't see clearly enough to stop." Arthur tapped the folder. "I've got pieces. Financial irregularities, certain board relationships that don't make sense. A pattern of decisions that consistently benefits one outside fund at the expense of long-term company health. But I'm running out of time, and I need eyes inside the organization that nobody will know are watching." Mason had looked at the folder, then back at the old man. "You want a spy?" "I want a driver," Arthur said, "who happens to notice things." The decision hadn't been simple. Mason had talked it through with Haley that weekend in the way he'd learned to talk things through with her, not asking for permission exactly, but being honest about what it would mean. Haley was 16 then, smart and self-possessed in the way of kids who'd grown up moving between deployments and grief, who'd learned early that the adults in their lives weren't infallible. "Would you be home for dinner?" she'd asked. "Most nights, it's a driver position, not field work." She'd thought about it. "Would you carry a gun?" "Probably not. It's corporate, not combat." She'd made the face she made when she was processing something and wasn't quite satisfied with what she was hearing, but she also understood that her father needed work that engaged him at a level that ordinary security consulting never quite did. She'd seen what happened when he was bored and understimulated, the restlessness, the way he'd walk the perimeter of their house at midnight, the habit of sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee gone cold while he stared at something she couldn't see. "Okay," she'd said finally, "but I get to call you any time." "You already get to call me any time. I know. I'm saying it anyway." So Mason had taken the position. Arthur died 11 weeks later before Mason had found anything conclusive. But he'd stayed because what he'd started finding suggested the old man's instincts had been right. Vivienne Carrington was not an easy person to work for. Mason understood this fairly quickly, without judgment. She was 30 years old, which meant she'd inherited leadership of a major corporation at 29, which meant she'd spent the subsequent year constantly proving to people twice her age that she deserved the chair she was sitting in. That kind of pressure produced a specific type of person, decisive to the point of being inflexible, confident to the point of being dismissive, and deeply allergic to any suggestion that she might be wrong about something. She was also, when she thought nobody was watching, visibly tired in a way that suggested she hadn't slept a full night in months. Mason had noticed that early on. He noticed most things. Their working relationship had established itself according to Vivienne's preferences: professional, bounded, functional. She used the back seat for calls and document review. She occasionally asked Mason's opinion on traffic routes. She said good morning and good night. Beyond that, the separation between her world and his was complete, and from her perspective, appropriate. She was the CEO. He was the driver. That was the structure, and she trusted structure. The irony was that it was the structure she trusted that was being used against her. Warren Slade had been head of corporate security at Carrington Meridian for 6 years, which was long enough to make himself appear indispensable and to build a loyalty network inside the security team that ran on fear and favoritism in roughly equal measure. He was the kind of security professional who confused authority with competence, a man who had made his career on the appearance of control rather than its substance. He was also, Mason had concluded after 14 months of careful observation, being paid by someone outside the company to keep certain people unprotected in certain ways. Mason couldn't prove all of it, not yet, but he had enough to know the threat was real, and the gala was the pressure point. The Carrington Meridian Annual Gala was the company's signature event. Investors, board members, media, the kind of gathering that projected stability and success to the people who needed to believe in both. It was scheduled 3 days out. The hotel had already been scouted, the routes already established, the security arrangements already communicated to a list of people that was, Mason had come to understand, too long by at least one name. He found the GPS tracker on a Tuesday. He'd been doing his morning vehicle inspection, something he'd started doing more thoroughly than strictly required, out of habit, when he noticed a small magnetic residue mark on the rear axle housing that didn't match the chassis wear pattern. He'd lain down on the cold concrete and looked with a pen light, and there it was. The device was sophisticated, not police grade, not consumer, military or closed military spec, the kind that reported location data on an encrypted channel. Someone had access to Vivienne's vehicle who shouldn't have had it, or someone inside her security apparatus had installed it deliberately. Mason stood up, photographed it, and went directly to Vivienne's office. She was on a call. Her assistant, a careful young man named Drew, had given Mason the look that meant please wait, and Mason had sat in the anteroom for 11 minutes watching the second hand on the wall clock and running through what he knew. When Vivienne finally came out, she looked at him the way she often looked at him when he stepped outside the lane of what his job officially required, a polite but clear expression that meant this had better be necessary. "There's a tracking device on the vehicle," Mason said. She blinked. "What?" Installed on the rear axle housing, military grade. It's been there at least a week, possibly longer. He showed her the photographs on his phone. I can show you the exact location if you want to see it yourself. Vivienne looked at the photographs. Her expression cycled through several things quickly. Surprise, then a kind of controlled alarm, then something that settled into corporate skepticism. Have you shown these to Warren? Not yet. I wanted you to see them first. Why? Mason hesitated a fraction of a second. Because some of what I've been tracking over the past few months involves decisions made inside the security department. The expression shifted, closer to impatience now. Mason, that's a serious accusation. I know. Against a department head with 6 years of record here. I know what it sounds like. She handed his phone back. Show Warren. Let him investigate through proper channels. That's what those channels exist for. It was the reasonable response. Mason understood that. He also understood that it was exactly the wrong one, but he didn't have enough to make her see it yet. He went to find Warren. Warren Slade listened to Mason's report with the patient expression of a man who had already decided how the conversation was going to end. They were in the security operations room, monitors, equipment racks, the low hum of running systems. 2 of Warren's team members were present, which Mason noted because the choice to have witnesses seemed deliberate. When Mason finished, Warren leaned back in his chair and let a beat of silence pass. You found a GPS tracker, Warren said. Yes. On a vehicle that's in our secured fleet, in a garage that's under continuous camera surveillance. The cameras have gaps. Southeast corner has a 12-minute blind spot between 11 p.m. and midnight based on the rotation schedule. I mapped it. Warren's eyes didn't move. You mapped our camera rotation schedule. It's in the documentation you gave me when I started the position. Right. Warren stood up and turned toward the monitors, hands in his pockets. Here's my concern, Rourke, and I'm going to be straight with you because I think you deserve straight. He didn't sound like he thought Mason deserved anything particularly. You've come to me 3 times the past month with reports. The vehicle following us on Route 9 turned out to be a commercial real estate surveyor. The unauthorized access alert turned out to be an IT contractor working late. And now a GPS device that, for all we know, was installed by our own fleet management vendor during the last service cycle for route optimization purposes. That device is not fleet management hardware. The encryption signature is what? Something you identified how? You're a driver, Rourke, a very good driver, but a driver. Warren turned back to face him. The patience in his expression had curdled into something that looked almost like pity. You need to stay in your lane. I say that with respect. Mason looked at him for a moment. I'd like to see the service logs from the last maintenance cycle. I'll have someone pull them. The tone said he would not. Mason left. But that evening, he sat in the kitchen of the small apartment he shared with Haley and spread his notebook across the table. Haley was doing homework at the other end, headphones on, occasionally glancing at him over the top of her laptop. Bad day? She said, pulling one earbud out. Complicated day. Did they listen to you? Mason looked up. What makes you think they didn't listen to me? Because you have that face. I don't have a face. Dad, you absolutely have a face. She pulled the other earbud out and folded her laptop. Is it serious? He thought about how to answer that. The habit of protecting her from the weight of things was strong, but Haley was 17 now and she had inherited, whether she wanted it or not, a fairly accurate instinct for when he was understating something. I think someone is setting something up, he said finally, and I think they're counting on nobody believing me when I say so. Haley was quiet for a moment. Then you have to make it impossible not to believe you. Mason looked at his daughter. She went back to her homework like she hadn't just said the thing he needed to hear. The idea came to him around midnight. The problem wasn't evidence, he had evidence. The problem was that evidence presented to compromised people disappeared into the machinery of their compromise. Warren could dismiss his reports, misfile his documentation, reframe his concerns as instability or overreach. As long as Mason operated inside the normal reporting structure, he was handing everything he found to the person most motivated to make it disappear. So he needed to operate outside that structure, just once, just enough to make the threat undeniable. He drafted 3 separate versions of Vivienne's departure route for the gala night. Each version was plausible, each was based on actual scouting he'd done, and each differed in one specific detail: the final street before the hotel's private entrance. He gave version 1 to Warren, version 2 to Vivienne's executive assistant Drew, and version 3 to the head of the hotel's own security liaison. Then he waited. He waited 2 days while the gala approached, and the city outside continued being a city: indifferent, crowded, moving. On the night before the event, at 9:14 p.m., a dark blue SUV with no readable plates appeared at the top of Prescott Avenue and parked between two delivery trucks. Prescott Avenue was on the route he had given only to Warren Slade. Mason sat in his personal car half a block back and watched it for 40 minutes. The SUV didn't move. Nobody got out. The driver was a silhouette behind tinted glass. At 10:51 p.m., the SUV left. Mason wrote everything down in his notebook, including the partial plate he'd been able to capture, and sat in the dark for a long time after it was gone. He wasn't afraid exactly. It was more like the feeling of watching a storm that's been building offshore finally make landfall, a grim satisfaction at having predicted it, overshadowed by the knowledge of everything it was going to destroy if he couldn't stop it. He drove home. He made sure Haley's door was locked. He made sure his own phone was charged. And then he spent the rest of the night going through everything he had, organizing it into the clearest possible sequence, because tomorrow was the gala and the quiet phase of this thing was over. One way or another, it was going to break. The morning of the gala, Mason woke at 4:30 without an alarm. He lay in the dark for a few minutes, listening to the apartment breathe around him. The refrigerator cycling on in the kitchen, the sound of a truck somewhere on the street below. Haley's door closed at the end of the hall. He'd slept maybe 3 hours. Not because he was anxious exactly, but because his body had a way of recognizing high-stakes days before his conscious mind finished processing them, and it handled that recognition by refusing to stay still. He got up, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with his notebook open. The partial plate number from the Prescott Avenue SUV sat at the top of the page. Below it, in his cramped handwriting, the timeline he'd been constructing for the past 6 weeks. Dates, observations, the leaked route confirmed through the vehicle's appearance, Warren's name written and then circled twice. He looked at it the way he'd looked at mission briefings years ago, not trying to find something new, just making sure he hadn't missed something obvious. He hadn't missed anything obvious. What he had was clean, sequential, and damning, assuming anyone with authority over Warren Slade was willing to look at it. That was the variable he couldn't control. He closed the notebook, finished his coffee, and went to get dressed. Haley found him in the hallway at 6:15, already in his uniform, dark suit, white shirt, the small lapel pin that identified him as Carrington Meridian Executive Transport. She was in pajamas, hair pulled back, holding a piece of toast like she'd forgotten she was holding it. "You're leaving early," she said. "Gala day. Extra setup time." She looked at him the way she had the night before, that particular look she'd inherited from her mother, which combined concern with a refusal to be managed. "Is today the day you think something happens?" He almost said no automatically, which would have been a lie and she would have known it. "Today's the day I find out whether I'm right about something. And if you are right, then I'll handle it." Haley took a bite of her toast and chewed it. She was 17 years old and she was already better at sitting with uncomfortable information than most adults Mason had known professionally. "Okay," she said, "but you call me." "I will." "Dad, I mean it. You call me." "I know you mean it." She pointed at him with the toast. "That's not the same as agreeing." "I'll call you," he said. "I promise." She nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to her room. Mason stood in the hallway for a moment after her door closed, looking at the family photograph on the wall. Him, Haley, and Claire, taken at the coast about 8 years ago, before everything changed. Claire was laughing at something off camera. Haley was squinting into the sun. Mason was looking at his wife with an expression that still embarrassed him a little when he saw it, because it was so plainly uncomplicated, so purely happy. He straightened his lapel pin and left. The Meridian Grand Hotel occupied an entire city block in the financial district, and by 8 in the morning, it was already organized chaos. Catering trucks at the service entrance, florist vans double-parked on the side street, hotel staff moving with the particular focused urgency of people who knew that their employer's reputation was being judged in real time. Mason drove the Escalade through the private vehicle entrance, spoke briefly with the hotel's security liaison, a competent woman named Patricia who ran her operation with quiet efficiency, and then spent the next hour walking the building. This was, officially, his pre-event route confirmation. Practically, it was the third full walkthrough he'd done of this hotel in the past 10 days. He knew where every camera was. He knew the service elevator schedules, the loading bay access times, the location of the emergency generator in the sub-basement, the maintenance corridors that ran parallel to the main event spaces. He knew that the underground parking structure had an eastern vehicle entrance that was technically for hotel fleet only, and that its gate code hadn't been changed in 4 months. He knew that the corridor connecting the underground structure to the hotel's private elevator bank passed through an older section of the building that predated the renovation. Narrower ceilings, exposed conduit, a forgotten storage room that nobody seemed to use anymore. He'd parked a car down there 3 days ago. A plain gray maintenance sedan, registered to a Shell LLC he'd used for contract work, with a full tank of gas and a duffel bag in the trunk containing things he hoped he wouldn't need. He didn't like hoping. He preferred preparing. At Nini 45, Mason found Warren Slade in the hotel's security staging area, a windowless room off the main lobby that had been temporarily converted into a command post, monitors showing feeds from the various cameras throughout the venue. Warren was standing at the center of it with the look of a man surveying his kingdom. "Morning," Mason said. Warren glanced at him. "Rourke, vehicle positioned?" "In the private bay, yes." Mason paused. "I need 5 minutes. I've got 40 things happening right now." 4 minutes, then." He kept his voice level. "The Prescott Avenue SUV. I got a partial plate, ran it through a contact I have. The vehicle was purchased through a leasing company tied to a Shell entity that also appears in 2 of the financial documents I've been tracking. It's not coincidence." Warren stared at him. Around them, 2 other security team members were pretending to look at their monitors. "I don't know what financial documents you're referring to," Warren said carefully. "I know you don't. That's why I'm telling you directly." Mason met his eyes. "Warren, if I'm wrong, then this conversation cost you nothing. But if there's any chance I'm right, any chance at all, we need to change tonight's departure protocol. New route, communicated only to people on a list we choose together, 30 minutes before Vivienne leaves." Warren was quiet for 3 seconds. In Mason's experience, 3 seconds of that particular quality of quiet from a man like Warren Slade meant a calculation was happening, not a consideration. "You accessed restricted financial records," Warren said. "I accessed documents that were shared with me through the course of... Those records are restricted above your clearance level. The fact that you've been reviewing them is a problem." He said it without heat, which was worse than if he'd been angry. Anger would have meant the accusation surprised him. This was composed. This was prepared. "I'm going to need to document this conversation." Mason looked at him for a long moment. "Of course," Mason said. He left. He found Vivienne at 10:20 in the hotel's executive suite on the 14th floor, where she'd been doing back-to-back calls since 7 a.m. She opened the door herself. Drew was somewhere managing a seating arrangement crisis, and she was already in her gala attire, dark navy dress, hair done, the composed and polished presentation she wore like armor at events like this. Behind it she looked, to Mason's eye, like someone who had been running on caffeine and willpower for about 18 consecutive hours and was beginning to feel the edges. "Mason." She stepped back to let him in. "If this is about the tracker, it's about the tracker and the SUV and a shell company and Warren's reaction just now, which was not the reaction of someone hearing this for the first time." She stopped. Her expression went through something complicated. "What do you mean, not hearing it for the first time?" "He didn't ask about the SUV. I mentioned a partial plate, a Shell company connection, and he didn't ask a single question about either. He went straight to whether I'd accessed restricted records." Mason sat down. She hadn't offered it, but the suite had a chair near the window, and he needed her to see he wasn't leaving in 30 seconds. "Vivienne, when someone threatens you with a procedural violation the moment you raise a security concern, they're trying to shut down the conversation, not address the concern." She stood near the door. The composure was in place, but it was working harder than usual. You're describing something very serious about someone with a 6-year record here." "I know. And your evidence is his reaction to a conversation?" "My evidence is 14 months of documented observations, a GPS tracker with military spec encryption, a confirmed leaked route, and his reaction to a conversation." He kept his voice even. He wasn't angry. Anger would give her something to push against. I'm asking you to delay tonight's departure protocol. Change the route at the last moment. Don't communicate the change through Warren's chain. She looked at him, really looked at him, the way she almost never did. Not past him, not at the version of him that stood beside her car door and held the schedule. At him. Then she looked away. Mason, I have 40 investors in this building tonight. I have a board vote next week that determines whether this company stays independent. I have a merger negotiation that Conrad has been pressuring me to close for 3 months. She shook her head slightly. I cannot walk into this evening carrying the weight of a theory that my own head of security is compromised. Not tonight. That's exactly why. I hear you, she said, and her voice had the particular firmness of a decision already made. I do. But I need you to trust that I know this company and the people in it, and that Warren Slade has done nothing in 6 years to suggest this level of... She stopped, gathered herself. Stay in your lane tonight, please. Can you do that? Mason was quiet. I'll do my job, he said. He meant something different by it than she thought he did. I was back in the security staging area at 11:15 when Warren pulled him aside. 2 members of Warren's team flanked the corridor in a way that wasn't accidental. I've spoken with Ms. Carrington, Warren said. So have I. Then you know she's made her position clear. He paused, and what came next was delivered with the smoothness of something rehearsed. I've also been reviewing some anomalies in the vehicle access logs. It seems like your credentials were used to access the building schematics database twice in the past 3 weeks at times when you weren't logged on duty. Mason said nothing. Combined with the unauthorized access to restricted financial documentation, which you essentially admitted to this morning, I don't have a lot of choice here from a liability standpoint. Warren looked almost regretful about it. The performance was reasonably good. I'm suspending your access credentials pending an internal review. You'll need to surrender your vehicle key fob and your facility badge. You're pulling me off the assignment. For tonight, yes, given the circumstances. Mason unclipped the key fob from his belt and handed it over. Then the badge. He did it slowly, not because he was reluctant, but because he wanted Warren to have to stand there and hold his gaze while he did it. You're making a mistake, Mason said. I'm managing a risk, Warren said. I know. Mason looked at him steadily. So am I. He walked toward the service exit. Behind him, he heard Warren say something to one of his team members, the tone of a man who'd just solved a problem. Relaxed, satisfied, moving on. Mason pushed through the service door and descended the stairs. The hotel's underground service level was a different world from the polished floors above. Concrete walls, exposed piping, the smell of diesel and cleaning chemicals, an old building. Mason walked through the lower service corridor with his hands in his pockets, moving at the pace of someone who belonged there and knew where he was going. He did know where he was going. The gray maintenance sedan sat exactly where he'd left it, in the far corner of a secondary parking bay that the hotel used for overflow vehicle storage. Unglamorous, invisible, one of a dozen identical vehicles that various service contractors had parked in similar spots. Nobody had touched it. Nobody had noticed it. Mason sat in the driver's seat, but didn't start the engine. He pulled out his phone and sent a single text message to a number he'd been holding in reserve for weeks, a former Navy colleague named Patrick Osei, who now worked in financial crimes investigation at the federal level and who had agreed months ago, in the careful way of someone who understood exactly what they were agreeing to, that if Mason sent him a specific word, it meant the timeline had accelerated and everything Mason had been assembling needed to be treated as active. The word was Tuesday. Today was Friday. The word didn't change. It had been chosen for precisely this kind of urgency. He sent the message, set his phone to vibrate only, and then he waited. The hours between noon and 8 p.m. had a specific quality of suspension to them, like the silence between lightning and thunder. Mason stayed in the lower service level, moving occasionally to different positions, checking the eastern vehicle entrance, watching the freight elevator operation, timing the camera rotation in the underground structure with a stopwatch he kept in the duffel bag. He ate a sandwich he'd packed that morning. He thought about Haley doing her Saturday homework at the kitchen table. At 3:40, he walked the older maintenance corridor again, the one that connected the underground structure to the private elevator bank. The forgotten storage room was still empty, still unlocked, He propped the door open 2 inches with a piece of folded cardboard so it wouldn't close completely on its own. At 5:15, he positioned himself near a utility junction where he could see the hotel's main vehicle bay monitor through a gap in the equipment housing and had clear sightlines to the eastern entrance. He'd brought a second notebook from the duffel and used the time to write out, in clean, organized sequence, everything he intended to present if tonight ended the way he thought it would. At 7:02, his phone vibrated. Patrick's reply. Received. We're watching. 2 words. They didn't mean help was coming, they meant someone credible was aware. For now, that was enough. Upstairs, the gala was reaching its peak. 300 guests, waitstaff moving through the crowd with trays. The low, pleasant roar of a room full of powerful people performing their best versions of themselves for each other. Mason could hear none of it from where he was. He knew it was happening because he'd studied the event schedule until he could have recited it backwards. He knew Vivienne was at the main table near the east wall, which put her 40 feet from the private elevator bank and roughly 4 minutes from the underground vehicle bay, by his estimate. He also knew that Conrad Whitmore, board vice chairman, architect of the merger proposal that Vivienne had been resisting for 3 months, was scheduled to present revised merger terms to Vivienne privately at 9:15 in the executive meeting room off the main ballroom. This detail had been in the event briefing documents that Mason had seen before his credentials were pulled. He had thought about that meeting all day. There was something about the timing of it, the gala night, the private presentation, the pressure to sign, that fit too neatly into the rest of what he'd assembled. If someone needed Vivienne gone for 36 hours, and they needed her gone in a way that couldn't be attributed to the people orchestrating it, then what better backdrop than a chaotic night when her own security was already staged around a false route, when the cameras were already compromised, when the only person who'd seen it coming had already been walked out of the building. Almost. Whoa. At 10:47 p.m., Mason's watch alarm, the silent vibration he'd set 12 hours earlier, went off. He was already watching the underground structure camera feed on his phone through an app connected to a small wireless transmitter he'd placed on a structural beam 3 days ago. As the alarm vibrated on his wrist, the feed went dark. Not glitched. Not frozen. Dark. All 4 camera angles covering the scheduled departure route cut simultaneously. Mason was already moving. He went up through the maintenance stairwell, the one that came out through the storage room near the private elevator bank. He moved without rushing because rushing made noise, and he had enough time if he moved efficiently. 12 years of operating in conditions where the margin between right and wrong was measured in seconds had given him a specific kind of physical economy. No extra movement, no wasted breath, everything purposeful. He reached the storage room and held the door open an inch, listening. Voices. From the direction of the elevator bank. He recognized Warren's immediately, but it took a moment to place the second one. A younger man's voice, slightly nervous, one of Warren's team members named Becker. She's coming down. Conrad said she refused to sign. Doesn't matter, Warren said. She doesn't have to sign. She just has to disappear long enough for the board to act. A pause. Elevator chime. Mason opened the storage room door and stepped into the corridor. He could see the elevator bank 30 feet away. Warren, Becker, and 2 other men he didn't recognize. Not hotel, not Carrington Meridian, body language wrong for either. Vivienne was stepping off the elevator, her composure intact even now, even as she registered the scene in front of her with the quick calibration of someone who understood something had shifted. Change of plans, Warren said to her. We're taking the south vehicle bay tonight. Security concern about the original route. Vivienne looked at Warren. What security concern? I'll brief you in the car. She looked at the 2 unfamiliar men. Something in her face shifted. Not fear exactly, but the tightening of someone who has just processed a piece of information that doesn't fit the picture they'd been holding. The South Bay, she said slowly. That's not the protocol route. Ms. Carrington, that's not the protocol route, Warren. Mason stepped out of the corridor and into the elevator bank. Vivienne saw him first. Her expression cycled through something too fast to name. Surprise, confusion, and then, underneath those, something that might have been relief, though she clearly hadn't expected to feel it. Warren turned. His face changed completely. The controlled, administrative confidence of 40 minutes ago was gone. What replaced it was harder and much more honest. What the hell are you doing here? He said. Mason crossed the space between them at a walking pace. He stopped 6 feet away from Warren and reached into his jacket pocket and set the GPS tracker on the concrete floor between them. The device blinked its small red light steadily. "Don't get in that car," he said to Vivienne. "Rourke," Warren started, and then the power went out. The underground structure dropped into emergency lighting, dim amber strips along the floor level, just enough to see shapes. For 2 seconds, nobody moved. Then, from the eastern vehicle entrance, the sound of engines. 3 black SUVs came through the gate simultaneously, moving fast, headlights cutting through the amber dark. They were inside the structure before the gate had fully retracted. They'd had the code, or someone had given it to them, because it opened on schedule and closed behind them. The vehicles stopped in a V formation 30 feet away. Doors opened. Men in dark clothing, faces covered, moving with the unhurried coordination of people who'd rehearsed this. Warren took a step back. The 2 unfamiliar men who'd come down with him did not. They exchanged a glance and then stepped sideways, away from Warren, positioning themselves in a way that said clearly, they were not on his side of whatever was happening. The operation had just revealed itself, and Warren Slade, Mason saw, had just realized he was not at the center of it. He was a piece of it, a piece that was probably more useful disposed of than preserved. Vivienne stood completely still. She looked at the SUVs, at the masked men spreading across the structure, at Warren, who was backing toward the wall, at Mason, who had not moved. "Mason," she said. Her voice was controlled, but he could hear something underneath it working very hard to stay that way. "What's happening?" He had planned to be clinical about this, explanatory, professional. Instead, what he said was simpler. "We need to go, right now." He took 2 steps toward the gray sedan. "Come with me." She hesitated for 1 second. 1 full second, in which he could see her weighing everything she thought she knew against what was right in front of her eyes. Then Vivienne Carrington picked up the hem of her navy dress, crossed the concrete floor, and got in the passenger seat. Mason started the engine before she'd closed the door. Warren shouted something behind them. One of the masked operatives broke toward the sedan. Mason reversed out of the parking spot in a single clean arc, switched to drive, and moved towards the maintenance corridor entrance, the one the SUVs were too wide to follow them through. He heard the sound of the pursuers' doors slamming behind them, engines revving, the echo of it filling the concrete space. Then they were in the corridor, and the sound dropped away. The sedan's headlights lit the narrow passage in front of them. Exposed piping, old concrete, a space that felt like the building's forgotten skeleton. Vivienne had one hand braced against the dashboard, and she was breathing deliberately, the controlled breath of someone managing something. Neither of them spoke for 30 seconds. "The route you gave Warren," she said finally, "was different from the routes I gave the other 2 people. Yes." She was quiet. "The SUV on Prescott Avenue," she said. "That was 2 nights ago." "Yes." "And you had this car here already." 3 days ago, yes." Another silence. The corridor curved ahead of them, and Mason slowed slightly to take it, the sedan's suspension scraping once on an uneven floor section. "How long?" Vivienne said. The question was stripped of everything except what it actually was, not accusatory, not defensive, genuinely needing to know. How long have you seen this coming?" He thought about Arthur, about the dying man in the Connecticut facility with the hawk eyes and the folder of documents, about 14 months of early mornings and careful notebooks and a daughter who'd pointed at him with a piece of toast. "A while," he said. It wasn't enough of an answer, and he knew it. "We'll talk," he said. "Once we're somewhere, they can't get to us. I'll tell you everything." Vivienne turned her face toward the side window, where the corridor wall scrolled past in the headlights. He couldn't see her expression fully. He wasn't sure what he would have made of it if he could. What he could hear when she exhaled was that the performance had finally come down. The investor-facing CEO, the polished armor of her public composure. She'd set it aside for a moment, and what was underneath was just a person who had been moving very fast in a very dangerous situation, surrounded by people she'd trusted, and had very nearly stepped into a car that would have ended everything. "Okay," she said quietly, almost to herself. Mason drove. The maintenance corridor ended at a freight barrier, which he raised with a remote on the sedan's visor. He'd programmed it 2 weeks ago while doing a routine vehicle check in this section of the building. Nobody had asked him about it. Nobody had noticed. The barrier lifted. The city opened up in front of them. He drove into it without looking back. The city at 11 p.m. was a different animal from the city during the day. Mason drove north through the financial district, taking side streets where the lights ran long and the traffic was sparse, keeping his speed exactly at the limit. Nothing that would attract attention, nothing that would mark the gray sedan as anything other than a service vehicle heading somewhere unremarkable on a Friday night. Vivienne had said nothing since they'd cleared the freight barrier. She sat with her hands in her lap, the navy gala dress incongruous against the sedan's plain interior, watching the city scroll past her window, the way people watch things when they're not really seeing them. He gave her the silence. She'd earned it. His own mind was running the way it ran in the field. Split level, one track on immediate tactical concerns, another track already 3 steps ahead. He checked the mirrors every 30 seconds. No headlights holding a consistent distance behind them. The eastern entrance to the hotel structure would have taken the SUVs at least 4 minutes to reverse out of once they understood which way Mason had gone, and by then the corridor route had put them far enough into the city's street grid that following became a probability problem rather than a pursuit. They weren't being followed. Not yet. He had maybe an hour before Warren reorganized and started working phones, before Conrad's people began establishing perimeters around the obvious destinations. Vivienne's apartment, her office, her assistant's address. The hotel itself was already compromised. They needed somewhere that wasn't on any list connected to either of them. Mason took a right on Caldwell and headed toward the river. "Where are we going?" Vivienne asked. Her voice had settled into something quieter than usual, the performance register entirely absent. "A place I use for contract work sometimes. It's not connected to you or to the company. Nobody's going to look for us there." She nodded but said nothing else, which he took as acceptance. The workshop. He'd been calling it that in his head for 2 years, though it was technically a leased storage unit in a converted industrial building near the waterfront, was a 20-minute drive under normal conditions. Mason took 35 minutes, looping twice through different neighborhoods, watching the mirrors with the focused patience of someone who understood that the cost of paranoia was time and the cost of overconfidence was everything else. When he finally pulled through the building's rear lot and parked under the loading dock overhang, he sat for a moment before getting out, scanning the lot, the adjacent street, the roofline. Quiet. Just the river smell and a distant foghorn. "Okay," he said. "We're clear." The workshop was one large room, about 800 square feet, with exposed brick walls and industrial shelving along the perimeter. It had a work table, a heavy-duty lock on the door, a bathroom the size of a closet, and a second-hand couch that Mason kept there because some nights the work ran long and the drive back wasn't worth it. It smelled like machine oil and old paper, which somehow made it feel more trustworthy than places that smelled like nothing. He unlocked it and let Vivienne in ahead of him, then secured the door from the inside. She stood in the middle of the room and took it in. The shelving held organized binders, a scanner, a laptop docking station, maps pinned flat by binder clips, and 2 external hard drives in a fireproof lockbox. On the work table, spread under a clear acrylic sheet, was a large grid of documents that Mason had been assembling over the past 3 months. Financial records, organizational charts, printed communications, handwritten annotations connecting them with lines in 3 different colors. Vivienne looked at the table for a long time without speaking. "This is about my company," she said finally. "Yes." She walked to the table and bent slightly to read. Mason watched her face as she processed it. The careful, intelligent movement of her eyes across the material, the small tightening around her mouth when something landed. "These are internal transfer records," she said. "Second quarter. How did you get these?" "Your father gave me access to a secondary records archive before he died. An offline backup he maintained independently. Warren never knew it existed." Vivienne straightened. She looked at him directly for the first time since the garage. "My father." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. He could see her recalibrating, not just the threat, but her understanding of the sequence of events that had led to this room. "He knew you," she said. It wasn't a question exactly. "He hired me, about 2 months before he died." Mason moved to the other side of the work table. He needed her to understand the full scope of it, and he needed to do it clearly, without softening it into something easier to hear than it was. He'd found irregularities in certain board-level financial decisions, patterns that suggested someone was systematically positioning one outside fund to benefit from internal Carrington Meridian policy shifts. He suspected Conrad Whitmore. He didn't have enough to act on, and he didn't trust the channels inside the company to investigate cleanly. So he brought in someone from outside. Someone nobody would look at twice. Vivienne looked at the document grid on the table. She reached out and touched one of the papers, a printed shell company registration, without picking it up, as if confirming it was real. You've been investigating us from my own back seat for a year and a half. I've been protecting you from your own back seat. The investigation is what made the protection possible. She looked up. Is there a difference? He thought about that honestly. For your father, there was. He was more concerned about the company. I was more concerned about you. He paused. Not the same thing, as it turned out. Something moved through her expression that he couldn't quite categorize. She looked back at the table. Tell me, she said. All of it. From the beginning. Well, Mason talked for 40 minutes. He walked her through everything in the sequence he'd documented, the early financial irregularities Arthur had flagged, the pattern of board decisions that consistently benefited the Whitmore family fund, Warren's hiring history, and the loyalty network he'd built from it, the escalating security anomalies over the past 6 months, the GPS tracker, the SUV on Prescott Avenue, and the confirmed route leak. He showed her the documents as he referenced them, not summarizing, just laying it out the way you laid a case out, clearly, without editorializing, letting the material speak for itself. Vivienne listened without interrupting. This was, Mason had noticed over 18 months, one of her genuine abilities. She could give something her full attention when she decided it mattered. The problem had always been the deciding. When he finished, she sat on the edge of the work table and crossed her arms. Not defensively. More like she was holding herself together against the weight of it. The 36 hours, she said. Walk me through that again. Conrad needs you absent and unreachable for 36 hours. The company's emergency succession protocol allows the board to appoint a temporary acting CEO if the standing CEO is, and I'm using the bylaw language, unable to fulfill leadership duties due to extraordinary circumstances. It was written as a safeguard against genuine incapacitation. Conrad's been on the governance committee for 4 years. He understands the mechanism better than anyone. If I'm missing, Vivienne said slowly, declared missing by Warren, framed as, what, a kidnapping? The original plan was probably simpler. You disappear after the gala, circumstances unclear, Warren controls the internal narrative. Conrad calls an emergency board session, invokes the succession provision, appoints himself temporary CEO. He has the votes from 4 board members whose funds are connected to the Whitmore family network. I can show you those connections in the documents if you want. As acting CEO, he authorizes the merger. The hidden voting clause takes effect, and by the time you resurface, the legal transfer of controlling interest is already processed. Vivienne stared at the middle distance for a moment. And Warren, what was he getting? Based on the financial records, he was getting paid. Also, I think he was getting out. His exit from the company was built into the timeline. He'd have resigned within a week, citing personal reasons, been compensated from one of the shell structures, and been gone before anyone started asking questions. And instead, he's standing in an underground garage watching operatives he thought he controlled not follow his orders. Yes, she let out a slow breath. He didn't know the full scope of what Conrad had arranged. Almost certainly not. That's how these structures work. Each person knows their piece. Warren knew his job was to get you into that vehicle. He probably didn't know what happened after that. Mason paused. Which, for what it's worth, doesn't make him less culpable. He knew enough. I know, she said quietly. I know it doesn't. The room was still. Outside, somewhere over the river, a barge was moving. Mason could hear the low churn of it through the brick wall. I told you to stay in your lane, Vivienne said. You did. Twice. 3 times, actually, but I wasn't counting. She looked at him. For a moment he thought she might say something about that. Something apologetic or self-recriminating. Instead she said, "What's your real background? Not the driver resume, the actual one." He'd known this was coming. He'd been deciding since the garage how much to tell her and in what order, and he'd concluded that the answer was all of it, because anything less would be a different kind of dishonesty, and he was done with strategic omissions for the evening. Navy SEAL, he said. 11 years. I left when my wife got sick and didn't go back after she died. My daughter was 8. He said it plainly, without the performance of either modesty or weight. Your father found me through a referral chain from someone I'd worked with on a private security contract. He did his research before he reached out. He knew the service record. He knew about Claire. He knew about Haley. He made a case that I'd be harder to find and harder to disregard than a traditional investigator, and he was probably right about both. Vivienne was watching him. Did you consider it? Not taking the position? Briefly. What changed your mind? He was dying, Mason said, and he was scared for his daughter. I understood both of those things. The silence that followed had a different quality than the ones before it. Less suspended, more settled. Vivienne looked down at the document table. So you sat in my back seat for 1.5 years. Roughly. While I treated you like a very reliable piece of the logistics infrastructure. Mason didn't say anything to that, which was its own kind of response. She laughed. A short, involuntary sound, more rueful than anything. Yeah. She pressed 2 fingers to her temple. My father would have found that appropriately poetic. He had a particular sense of humor, I'll say that. She looked at him sideways. You liked him. I respected him. He was straight with me from the first conversation. That's not as common as it should be. Something in her face shifted then. Something private. The expression of someone thinking about a person they missed. She didn't say anything about it, and he didn't push. Okay, she said, with the tone of a person who has finished grieving a surprise and is now ready to move. What do we do? Mason had been thinking about this part since he'd sent the text to Patrick Osai. The problem was sequencing. They had evidence, comprehensive, well-documented, the kind that didn't rely on interpretation because the facts arranged themselves into a shape that only pointed one way. What they didn't have was a venue for it. You couldn't hand a folder to investigators and expect it to freeze a corporate takeover in real time. Institutional machinery moved slowly, and Conrad's mechanism moved fast. And if the board convened an emergency session before Mason could get the right material to the right people with enough context to act on it, the 36 hours would run regardless of what happened to Mason and Vivienne afterward. They needed to get back inside the company before Conrad completed his move. This was the part that required him to explain something that he knew, even as he prepared to say it, was going to land badly. I think we need to go back, he said. Vivienne stared at him. Back where? Carrington Meridian Tower, the main boardroom. Tonight, if we can manage it, or first thing tomorrow morning before Conrad can schedule an emergency session. She stood up from the work table. Warren has the building locked down by now. Probably. With a narrative that you're, unstable? That you took me by force? That's my best guess at what he told people, yes. So we're going to walk into a building that's locked down against us, in the middle of an active conspiracy, with documents, and then what? Hold an impromptu board presentation? More or less, Mason said. She stared at him for another second. You're serious? If Conrad gets an emergency board session convened before we can show anyone what's in these documents, he wins. It doesn't matter what happens to Warren. It doesn't matter what investigators eventually find. The legal transfer will have already processed, and unwinding it takes years of litigation that the Whitmore Fund is better positioned to survive than you are. He held her gaze. You need to be in that building before he schedules that session. Vivienne pressed both hands flat on the work table and looked at the document grid beneath the acrylic sheet. Tell me the plan, she said. Oh, they worked for 2 hours. Mason spread the physical copies of everything across the work table in a different arrangement. Not the investigative sequence, but the presentation sequence, organized for maximum clarity and minimum room for dismissal. He walked her through each document cluster so she understood not just what it was, but how it connected to the next thing, because she was going to need to speak to this material without his help once they were in the tower. He made copies of the highest priority items on the scanner, encrypted them, and sent them to Patrick Osei's secure line. He photographed everything with his phone as a third redundancy. Vivienne changed out of the gala dress into clothes from a go bag he kept in the workshop, a dark sweater, a pair of jeans that were too big for her, and required a belt she had to punch a new hole in with a screwdriver, her own heels replaced by a pair of his old running shoes that she wore with the laces double knotted and without complaint, though they were 4 sizes too large. She rolled the jeans twice at the ankle and looked, when she stood back up, nothing like the CEO of a billion-dollar corporation and entirely like herself. Mason thought briefly that this version of Vivienne Carrington was probably more formidable than the polished one. He didn't say that. At 1:15 in the morning, his phone rang. Patrick. He picked up immediately. "Your file came through," Patrick said. He had a low, unhurried voice that Mason had always trusted precisely because it never modulated for drama. "We've been watching Whitmore's fund for 8 months. Some of what you sent fills gaps we couldn't close." "Enough to move on?" "Getting there. The shell company payments to Slade are going to be the clearest thread. I need the originating account documentation from the Q3 transfer records. I have them. I can get them to you in the next 2 hours. Do that." A pause. "Mason, these people have resources. If they're in operational mode tonight, you need to be somewhere defensible." "I'm going back into the tower." Silence on the line. "That's not what I would call defensible." "I know. You understand that I can't give you official cover for that, not at this stage." "I know that too." Mason turned away from Vivienne slightly, not for privacy. She could hear everything and he wasn't trying to hide it, but because the next part was harder to say out loud. "If we don't get back in there before Conrad calls a board session, the corporate mechanism completes regardless of what the investigation finds. She loses her company." "Then don't let him call the session," Patrick said. And that was all, because Patrick understood the parameters and didn't fill silence with reassurance he couldn't back up. They hung up. Mason scanned the Q3 transfer documents and sent them. When he turned back, Vivienne was watching him. "Who was that?" she asked. "Someone with a federal mandate who's been watching Conrad's fund for most of a year." Something went through her face. "So this is larger than just my company." "Your company was the operational piece. The Whitmore Fund has been using similar mechanisms in smaller acquisitions for 3 years. Your father caught the pattern because he knew his own business well enough to see when something was off." Mason paused. He was right about everything. He just ran out of time. Vivienne was quiet for a moment. "He would have told me," she said. "Eventually, if he'd had more time." "I think so, yes. But instead he told you. He told me what he knew and trusted me to do the rest." Mason met her eyes. "For what it's worth, everything I found over the past year suggests he knew his company very well and knew his daughter very well, and he understood that the approach that would actually work was not the one that involved telling you directly. Because I would have confronted Conrad immediately." "Yes." She made a sound that was half acknowledgement, half something more complicated. "He knew me too well sometimes." "Fathers usually do," Mason said. It came out with less professional distance than he'd intended. He moved toward the equipment shelf and started packing the documents for transport, and if Vivienne noticed the shift, she was gracious enough not to comment on it. They left the workshop at 1:45. Mason drove the sedan into a district 3 blocks from Carrington Meridian Tower and parked in a public lot that backed onto a commercial alley. He had a specific route into the tower in mind, not through the lobby, not through the parking structure, and not through any entrance that Warren's team would have thought to cover, because Warren's team was good at conventional security, and conventional security covered the conventional access points. Mason had spent 14 months identifying the ones that weren't conventional. Carrington Meridian Tower had been built in 2 phases, which meant the original structure's utility infrastructure didn't fully integrate with the additions. There was a gap, not a physical gap, but a jurisdictional one, in the service corridor network on the building's north side, where the original building's maintenance access connected to the addition's loading infrastructure through a passage that predated the current security camera installation. The corridor appeared on the original building schematics, which were part of the infrastructure documentation that Arthur's offline archive contained, and which Mason had studied until he could have drawn them from memory. He'd walked that corridor once, 7 months ago, under the pretense of checking a utility concern that he'd invented, and then quietly resolved himself. He knew it was passable. He knew it came out in the service core of the tower's 4th floor, which connected via a freight elevator to the executive levels above. What he didn't know was how many of Warren's people were inside the building, or where they were positioned. This was the part that couldn't be fully planned. "When we're inside," Mason said, as they crossed the alley toward the utility access panel on the tower's north face, "stay behind me until I tell you otherwise. If something happens that I haven't anticipated, your job is to get to the boardroom floor by any route available and make noise. Loud, public noise. Your voice in that building is worth more than anything else we have." "Got it. I mean it. Don't try to help me with anything tactical. Just get visible." "Mason." She stopped walking. He stopped too and looked at her. She was carrying a waterproof folder with the organized documents inside, held against her chest, and she looked completely out of context in his oversized clothes in a maintenance alley at 2 in the morning, and she also looked like someone who had made a decision about something and was not going to be argued out of it. "I trust you," she said. "Do what you need to do." He hadn't expected that. Not the words, but the directness of them. No conditions attached, no qualifications. He'd spent 18 months working in the margins of her professional world, operating on the edges of her trust without ever being invited into its center, and the shift was jarring in a way he didn't have time to process. "Okay," he said. "Let's go." The utility access panel required a physical key that Mason had duplicated 14 months ago from the building manager's ring during a vehicle transport he'd handled for a facility inspection. He'd kept the duplicate on his personal keychain rather than the credential keyring that Warren had confiscated, which meant it was still in his jacket pocket. Small decisions made a year ago for reasons that seemed excessive at the time. They went through the panel and into the service corridor. Mason had a flashlight from the workshop. The corridor was what it had been 7 months ago. Dusty, narrow, functional, entirely ignored. Their footsteps on the concrete sounded too loud in the contained space, and he slowed their pace to minimize it. At the far end, the corridor opened into the building's original service core. Ahead was the freight elevator, a large industrial unit with a key-operated panel. Mason had the key for that too. He pressed the call button. The elevator descended with a grinding slowness that was testing in the specific way that slow mechanical things are testing when you're in a position where speed matters. Vivienne stood beside him in the dimness without fidgeting, which he noted because most people fidgeted. When the doors finally opened, they stepped inside, and Mason keyed the elevator for the 23rd floor, one below the main executive boardroom level, because arriving directly on the executive floor would put them in front of whatever security Warren had staged there. They rode up in silence. At the 22nd floor, Mason held the door and looked out. The secondary executive corridor, used mostly by support staff during business hours, largely empty after 5 p.m. He checked both directions. Clear. He stepped out. Vivienne followed. They took the internal stairwell up one floor, Mason moving first, his attention on sound rather than sight in the enclosed space. Voices, footsteps, radios. The stairwell was quiet. He eased the 23rd floor door open half an inch and looked through. The executive corridor. Lit, as it always was after hours, in the corridor's lower wattage overnight mode. He could see the main elevator bank at the far end, and he could see 2 men standing near it. Warren's people. They were talking to each other, which meant they were bored and had been standing there long enough to run out of professional vigilance. Between Mason and those 2 men was 60 feet of corridor. On the left side, 12 feet in, was the doorway to Vivienne's executive assistant suite, which connected internally to Vivienne's own office. On the right side, 20 feet in, was the door to the secondary conference room that the IT infrastructure team used for equipment storage. Mason turned back to Vivienne and spoke close to her ear, below the threshold of sound carrying. 2 men at the elevator. I need 30 seconds of distraction from the other end of the corridor. Is there any automated system in your office that you could trigger remotely? Phone, computer. Anything that makes noise. She thought for half a second. My desktop has a video conference auto-join for anything on my calendar. There's a board briefing scheduled for 7 a.m. tomorrow. If I send a test ping from my phone to that conference line, the desktop will activate and the audio system will chime. She paused. It'll also show my account is online, which might alert someone monitoring for that. That's fine. We want the distraction, not the secrecy. He looked at her. Can you do it in the next 90 seconds? She already had her phone out. He waited. 20 meters away on the other side of a door, the 2 security men continued their low conversation. Then, from down the corridor on the other side of the executive suite door, a chime. clear and corporate and completely routine sounding in the overnight quiet of the building, which somehow made it louder than anything urgent would have been. Both men looked toward the sound. Mason moved. He covered the distance to the IT storage room door in 8 steps, key already in hand. The storage room used the same service key system as the corridor doors, a simplification someone had made during the renovation that made maintenance easier and security slightly worse. He had Vivienne through the door and closed it behind them before either man completed their turn back. In the storage room, among the equipment racks and cable reels, he took one breath and listened. Footsteps in the corridor. One set, moving toward the executive suite. Then voices, indistinct. Then the footsteps returning. Then quiet. "Okay," Mason said quietly. "We need to get to the boardroom floor. One more stairwell, northeast corner of the building. It comes out directly into the anteroom." Vivienne nodded. Her eyes had adjusted to the storage room's dark, and she was watching him with a composure that he'd stopped expecting and started relying on. They moved. The northeast stairwell took them up to the 24th floor without incident. Whoever Warren had positioned in the building had been staged for the obvious entry points, the elevators and the main lobby stairs, and the service infrastructure had been, once again, invisible enough to be forgotten. Mason pushed the stairwell door open and stepped into the boardroom anteroom, and came face to face with Conrad Whitmore. Conrad was not alone. He had 2 men with him, not operatives, not security, but lawyers, identifiable by the document bags they were carrying, and the specific expression of people who are being paid to be present at something they'd rather not be present at. Conrad himself was in his gala clothes, jacket off, tie loosened, a man who had been expecting to wrap up a quiet piece of business and was now confronted with something he had categorically not planned for. He stared at Mason. Then he stared at Vivienne. Then at the waterproof folder in her arms. The calculation on his face was visible and remarkably rapid. The assessment of what their presence meant, what it implied about the operation at the hotel, what it implied about how much they knew. "Vivienne," Conrad said. His voice was smooth even now, the smoothness of a man who had been composing himself under pressure for 40 years. "I'm relieved you're safe. There was an incident at the—" "Conrad," Vivienne said. Her voice had returned to the register Mason recognized from her professional world. Not the armor exactly, but the authority. Quiet and clean and completely unapologetic. "Sit down." Conrad looked at the lawyers. One of them was already reaching for his phone. "I wouldn't," Mason said to the man with the phone. "Not threatening, just informational. Your client is about to be recorded in this room regardless of what happens with that call, and the distinction between being documented as someone who cooperated versus someone who was present and obstructive is going to matter a great deal in the next 48 hours. The lawyer looked at his phone, then at Conrad. Conrad sat down. Mason stepped to the boardroom door, opened it, and looked inside. The room was empty, the long table lit by overnight lighting that made the polished surface look like dark water. He turned back and met Vivienne's eyes. "Your building," he said. Vivienne Carrington walked past Conrad Whitmore and into her boardroom, the waterproof folder of documents held against her chest like something she intended to keep. Conrad Whitmore sat at the far end of the boardroom table, with his hands folded in front of him, and the specific stillness of a man who had decided that composure was the last form of control available to him. The 2 lawyers had taken seats against the wall rather than at the table, which Mason noted, a small physical declaration that they were witnesses rather than participants, already beginning the process of separating themselves from whatever their client had gotten them into. The younger one had put his phone away. The older one was looking at the document folder in Vivienne's hands with the expression of a professional who had just done a rapid calculation about where the night was heading. Mason locked the boardroom door from the inside and positioned himself where he could see both the door and Conrad simultaneously. He didn't sit. Sitting was for people who had the luxury of relaxing, and they were not there yet. Vivienne placed the folder on the table and opened it. She didn't speak immediately. She took out the first document cluster, the shell company registrations and their connections to the Whitmore Family Fund, and set them flat on the table in front of Conrad with the deliberate patience of someone who has been waiting a long time to do exactly this. Conrad looked at the documents. His face didn't change. "You should know," he said, "that Warren has already reported a security incident to law enforcement. The framing of tonight's events, from their perspective, is going to be the framing, Vivienne said, is going to change in the next 30 minutes. She sat down across from him. The framing always changes when someone shows up with the actual documents. Those documents were obtained through an archive that my father established before his death, using his own access credentials on systems he owned. Her voice was even, not angry, which Mason thought was probably more unsettling for Conrad than anger would have been. You can make an argument about admissibility in a courtroom if you want to get there. I'd focus on what's in front of you first. Conrad looked at the papers again. This time he picked one up. Mason watched him read it. There was a specific quality to Conrad's silence as he worked through the document. Not surprise exactly, but the careful measurement of a man assessing how much of the structure had been exposed. His eyes moved efficiently, which told Mason he understood what he was looking at and was cataloging rather than interpreting. When Conrad set the paper down, he looked at Mason for the first time since they'd entered the room. "You've been building this for how long?" "Long enough," Mason said. "Arthur." Conrad said the name with something that wasn't quite contempt and wasn't quite respect. A complicated middle register. I underestimated how far along he was. "Most people underestimate dying men," Mason said. "It's a consistent mistake." Conrad was quiet. Then, with the tone of someone shifting negotiating positions, "I want to be clear that the incident at the hotel tonight was not sanctioned by me at that level. The intent was—" "Conrad," Vivienne's voice cut across his cleanly. "Don't. I've been sitting across from you at board meetings for a year. I know what you sound like when you're constructing a position. And I need you to understand that we are not negotiating right now. You don't have anything left to negotiate with." He looked at her. For the first time, the composure showed a crack. Not in his expression, but in the pause before he responded, which was a beat too long. "What do you want?" he said. "I want you to sit there and not touch your phone," she said, "while I make some calls." The first call was to Drew. Her executive assistant picked up on the second ring despite the hour, which told Mason something about the quality of person Vivienne kept close to her. His voice on the other end was tightly controlled in the way of someone who had spent the past several hours in a state of managed alarm. "Ms. Carrington, are you safe?" "I'm in the boardroom. I'm fine." A pause. "Drew, I need you to call every board member personally, right now. Tell them we're convening an emergency session at 8 a.m. and that attendance is not optional. Tell them exactly that, not optional. Don't explain why on the phone." A short silence. "Warren told us—" "I know what Warren told you. I'm telling you something different." Another pause, shorter. "Drew, do you trust me?" "Yes, absolutely." "Then call the board." She hung up and made the second call. To the company's general counsel, a precise and careful woman named Miriam Chen, who, based on the documents Mason had assembled, appeared in none of Conrad's network connections, which had elevated her significantly in Mason's estimation. Miriam picked up after 4 rings, voice rough with interrupted sleep, and became thoroughly awake in approximately 15 seconds as Vivienne laid out the essential facts. "I need you in the tower by 6 a.m., Vivienne said. "I need you to bring the emergency succession bylaw documentation and the board charter, and I need you to call Arthur's attorney, James Whitfield. Tell him the contingency provision is being activated." On his end of the room, Mason saw Conrad's composure crack one more time and then reassemble. He'd registered the name Whitfield. Something about it had landed. Mason filed that away. After Vivienne ended the call with Miriam, she set her phone on the table and looked at Conrad. "My father's attorney holds a document," she said. "Arthur established it 2 years ago as an emergency voting structure. A proxy block on a specific percentage of founding shares, held in trust and activatable in the event of what the document describes as a governance crisis." She paused. "He called it his insurance policy. He never told me about it because he didn't want me to rely on it. He wanted me to be able to run the company without it." Conrad was very still. "He told James Whitfield," she continued, "and he told Mason, because he understood that an insurance policy is only useful if someone knows how to activate it." She looked at Mason. He gave her the smallest nod, confirming what she'd just said, because it was true. Arthur had walked him through the Whitfield arrangement in their second meeting as part of the comprehensive download of everything the old man had put in place. Conrad looked from Vivienne to Mason and back, and something in his face changed in a way that was difficult to describe. The deflation of a man who has just understood that the structure he built over years has a foundation problem he missed. He's had this since before you joined the board, Vivienne said. He was patient. He built things slowly. He didn't announce them. She leaned forward slightly. He was a lot like you in some ways, Conrad, just better at choosing what to build. Conrad looked at his hands. The lawyers against the wall were both now on their phones, quietly, with the purposeful focus of men who were beginning the process of formally disengaging from their client's situation. At 2:53 a.m., the boardroom door rattled. Mason moved to it. "Who's there?" A voice on the other side, young, female, slightly breathless. "It's Keen from IT operations. I need to talk to someone." Mason looked at Vivienne. She nodded. He unlocked the door. The woman who came in was in her late 20s, still in her work clothes. The Carrington Meridian IT operations team worked extended hours on gala nights to manage the event tech systems. Her name badge said R. Keen. She looked at the scene in the boardroom, Conrad at the end of the table, the lawyers against the wall, Vivienne with the documents spread in front of her, Mason by the door, and processed it with the rapid recalibration of someone who had knocked because she suspected something and was now certain. "I was monitoring the building systems tonight," she said. "When the camera feeds went down in the hotel, I flagged it internally, and Warren told me to log it as a technical issue and not escalate. It was the way he said it." She stopped. "I didn't log it as a technical issue. I saved the shutdown sequence data because it wasn't technical. Someone killed those feeds deliberately from an authenticated terminal inside our system, and the authentication credentials they used belonged to Warren Slade." Vivienne looked at Mason. He looked at the woman from IT. "Do you have that data with you?" Keen held up a USB drive. "I've had it in my pocket for 2 hours. I didn't know who to give it to." "Give it to her," Mason said, nodding toward Vivienne. Keen crossed the room and set the drive on the table. Then she looked at Conrad, who had gone very quiet, and said, with the bluntness of someone who has decided they've run out of reasons to be careful, "Mr. Whitmore, I've worked here for 4 years. I've watched you vote against every infrastructure improvement that didn't benefit your fund. I figured out what you were doing about 8 months ago, but I didn't think anyone would believe me." She paused. "I'm glad someone finally does." She walked to the far end of the room and sat down in a chair, as if she'd decided she wasn't leaving. Mason looked at her for a moment. Then he thought about Arthur Carrington again. The old man's conviction that the people inside his company, the ones who'd been there long enough to see the patterns, would eventually find a way to make themselves heard if someone gave them a reason to believe it was worth the risk. He'd been right about that, too. Over the next 90 minutes, 3 more people came to the boardroom. The first was a financial analyst named Torres from the second floor, who'd been working late. He kept odd hours, a habit his supervisors had tolerated because his output was exceptional, and who had heard, through the tower's internal communication channels, that something was happening on the executive floor. He brought a printed spreadsheet he'd been sitting on for 6 weeks, documenting a pattern of accounting adjustments that consistently understated certain performance metrics in the quarters before major board votes. He'd built it on his own time because he couldn't figure out who was safe to show it to. The second was Patricia, the hotel's security liaison, who had driven herself to the tower after watching the gala deteriorate and spending an hour trying to reach someone at Carrington Meridian who wasn't Warren. She had her own records from the hotel: camera access logs, vehicle entry records, documentation of the Eastern Gate Code being used twice outside of authorized hours in the past week. The third was the hardest to explain. His name was Becker, the same young security team member who'd been in the garage with Warren. At the moment, Mason stepped out of the corridor. He knocked at 3:45 in the morning alone, and when Mason opened the door, he was standing in the hallway with his hands visible and something on his face that was somewhere between exhaustion and relief. "I know what you probably think," he said to Mason. "Tell me anyway." "I didn't know what tonight was until I was in the garage and those SUVs came through the gate. Warren told me it was a protocol change, an extra security measure." He swallowed. "When I understood what was actually happening, I didn't stop it. I know that. But I also didn't help it." Mason looked at him for a long moment. "Where's Warren now?" "Still in the hotel. The operatives left after you got out. He's been on his phone for 3 hours. Becker hesitated. "He's scared. The people who ran the operation aren't responding to him anymore. Mason had expected that. Once the extraction attempt failed, the people Conrad had brought in through the outside structure would begin severing connections. Warren had known his piece of the plan and hadn't known enough about the rest of it to be dangerous, which made him a liability rather than an asset once things went sideways. "Come in," Mason said. "Sit down and tell me everything Warren said to you in the 48 hours before tonight." By 5 a.m., the boardroom looked entirely different from when they'd entered it. The table held 3 separate organized document sets, 2 laptops, Patricia's hotel records, Torres's spreadsheet, Keene's USB data, and Becker's handwritten account, which was rough and incomplete but added confirmation to 2 specific timeline points that Mason's documentation needed. Miriam Chen had arrived at 4:15 with 2 associates and Arthur's attorney James Whitfield, who was in his 70s, completely awake, and carried himself with the placid certainty of someone who had been waiting for this phone call for 2 years. Whitfield opened his own document bag and placed a sealed legal envelope on the table. "Arthur prepared this in the spring of the year he died," Whitfield said. "He told me that if I were ever contacted by either Vivienne or a man named Mason Rourke regarding a governance crisis, I was to bring this directly to the boardroom." He looked at Mason. "He described you accurately, by the way. Said you'd look like you hadn't slept and wouldn't seem particularly bothered by it." "He wasn't wrong," Mason said. Whitfield allowed himself a small smile and opened the envelope. The document inside was 9 pages, single-spaced, in Arthur's handwriting, not typed, not dictated, written out by hand in the deliberate way of someone who understood that handwritten documents carry a specific weight that printed ones don't. It established a voting proxy held in trust by Whitfield's firm, covering the shares tied to the founding family block, activatable upon documented evidence of governance fraud as defined by the board charter. Miriam read it once quickly, and then again slowly. When she set it down, she looked at Whitfield. "This overrides the succession provision." "Yes, that was its purpose." Whitfield folded his hands on the table. Arthur was specific about that. He wanted a fail-safe that couldn't be circumvented by the same mechanism it was designed to stop. Conrad, who had been sitting in silence at the far end of the table for the past hour, looked at the handwritten document from across the room. Something in his expression had given up trying to look composed. He just looked tired. "It won't stop the regulatory inquiry," he said, to no one in particular. "No," Miriam agreed, "it won't. If I cooperate fully." "That conversation happens with investigators," Miriam said. "Not here." Conrad nodded slowly. He seemed to understand that the negotiating phase was over, not in defeat exactly, but with the resignation of a man who had played a long game and hit the end of the board. At 5:32, Patrick Osei arrived with 2 colleagues from his unit and 2 individuals who presented federal financial crimes credentials. They entered the boardroom, assessed the assembled documentation with professional efficiency, and began the process of formally taking custody of the material. One of Patrick's colleagues spoke briefly with Becker in the corner. Becker answered everything clearly, which Mason had thought he probably would. There was a particular quality to people who showed up and told the truth in the middle of a situation where lying would have been much easier. You tended to be able to trust what they said afterward. Patrick found Mason near the window and stood beside him, looking out at the city, which was beginning to pick up the first suggestion of pre-dawn gray on its eastern edge. "Your documentation is comprehensive," Patrick said. "The Q3 transfer records you sent at 2 a.m. were the connection we needed for the account trace." "Did you get the originating institution?" "Yes. It traces to a holding structure connected to Whitmore's fund in the Caymans. It's not a simple paper trail, but it's not invisible either." He paused. "Warren's going to cooperate. I'd be surprised if he doesn't. The alternative is carrying the whole weight of tonight without the people who hired him backing him up. He's already been cut loose." "I know. This is going to take months to fully prosecute." "I know that too." Patrick looked at him sideways. "You doing okay?" Mason thought about the question honestly. He was tired in the specific way of someone who has been running on purpose and adrenaline for an extended period and could feel the body beginning to present the bill. His knee ached, an old injury that announced itself reliably under stress. He was hungry. He had not called Haley since before the gala, which meant she had either trusted him or was pretending to trust him with the specific practiced patience she'd inherited from her mother. I need to make a phone call, he said. Go. He stepped out into the anteroom and called Haley. She picked up on the first ring, which meant she'd been awake. I'm okay, he said immediately, before anything else. A long exhale on her end. I know, I've been following the building alerts on the city scanner app. I set it up 3 months ago. She paused. I was waiting for you to call. He stood in the anteroom of the 24th floor of Carrington Meridian Tower at 5:41 in the morning, and for a moment the careful composure he'd been maintaining since 10:47 the previous night developed a small crack of its own. I should have called earlier. Yeah, you should have, she said, without accusation. But you were busy. It's okay. I'll be home in a few hours. I'll make breakfast. You don't have to… Dad, I want to make breakfast. A pause. Is it over? He looked through the boardroom's glass wall at the assembled scene inside. The documents, the investigators, Conrad Whitmore sitting quietly at the end of the table, Vivienne standing near the window talking to Miriam, James Whitfield reading something with his reading glasses on, Torres the analyst pouring himself a cup of coffee from a pot that someone had produced from somewhere. The ordinary human texture of a crisis reaching its end, and pretty much, he said. At 6:45, Warren Slade arrived at the tower. He came voluntarily, which Patrick had predicted, accompanied by a personal attorney and with the specific body language of a man who had been awake all night, making calculations, and had arrived at the least bad option available to him. He was escorted to a conference room on the 19th floor where federal investigators were waiting. He did not come to the 24th floor. He did not pass the boardroom. Mason did not go down to see him. There was nothing productive in that direction. At 7:15, with the board members arriving for the 8 a.m. session and the tower filling with the morning energy of an organization that had no idea what had happened overnight and was about to find out, Vivienne found Mason in the anteroom. She looked, honestly, like someone who had been awake for 24 hours in a gala dress and his borrowed clothes, which she was. And she had the specific quality of exhaustion that comes after sustained fear, slightly hollow around the eyes, too much awareness of small physical sensations. She was also clearly running on something, some internal fuel that wasn't quite adrenaline anymore, but wasn't ordinary either. She handed him a coffee. He took it. Miriam says the voting block is airtight, she said. Conrad can't call the succession provision. The proxy overrides it. Good. The board session this morning is going to be… It's going to be a lot. Yes. I'm going to have to explain all of this to 15 people who trusted Conrad for years. And some of them are going to be defensive about it. And some of them are going to be embarrassed. And some of them are going to be furious that they weren't told sooner. Probably all three at the same time from some of them. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. You could have told me sooner. I could have tried harder, he said. It was an honest answer, not a comfortable one. You also weren't exactly receptive. No, I wasn't. She looked at her coffee cup. I spent a year treating the most important person in my building like furniture. You treated me like a driver. That was the job. The job was your cover. You were the most important person in the building. He didn't argue with her, partly because he didn't have the energy, and partly because, in the narrow context of the past 14 months, she wasn't wrong. What happens to the people upstairs, she asked. Keene and Torres and Becker. That's your call, not mine. I know it's my call. I'm asking what you think. He considered it. Keene held evidence for 2 hours because she didn't know who to trust. Torres built a 6-week documentation project on his own time because he couldn't find a safe channel. Becker showed up at 3:45 in the morning and told the truth when lying would have been easier. He looked at her. Those aren't disloyal people. They're people who needed a reason to believe the company was worth being loyal to. Vivienne nodded slowly. I've been filtering the wrong things, listening to the wrong signals. She said it plainly, without the performance of self-flagellation, just acknowledging it as a fact. Your father's company attracted people worth keeping, Mason said. That's not an accident. It's a reflection of how he ran it for 40 years. Something moved through her face at that. She looked away for a moment toward the windows and the full morning light coming through them now, the city solid and indifferent outside. He chose well, she said quietly. In a lot of ways. The board members were filing past now, so Mason could see them through the glass, senior executives in morning professional wear, several glancing toward the anteroom with the barely concealed curiosity of people who had received an urgent summons and been given no explanation. Some of them recognized Mason from the vehicle bay or from event periphery, the slight double take of seeing him in this context. At 8 o'clock exactly, Vivienne straightened. She set her coffee cup on the anteroom table, smoothed the front of the oversized sweater she was wearing. His sweater, which she was apparently going to walk into a board meeting in, and which somehow seemed correct for the circumstances, and picked up the waterproof document folder. She turned to Mason. "I want you in the room," she said. He shook his head. "I don't belong in the board session." "I didn't ask whether you belonged. I said I want you in the room." She held his gaze. "You built the case that's about to end Conrad Whitmore's career and potentially put him in federal prison. You can stand in the room while I present it." He thought about arguing. The argument died somewhere between his throat and his mouth, because she was right, and also because he was too tired to be professional about it. He stood up. She walked into the boardroom. He walked in behind her. 15 board members looked up from their seats. The room smelled of coffee and the faint residual tension of people who had been called somewhere urgently and didn't know why. At the far end, Conrad's chair was empty, which some of them had clearly noticed and were processing. Vivienne set the folder on the table. "Good morning," she said. "I'm going to need about an hour of your full attention, and then we're going to have some decisions to make." She looked around the table with the composure of someone who had earned the right to be standing at the front of the room by a much harder route than most of them knew. "What I'm about to show you is going to be difficult. I ask that you hold your questions until I've walked through all of it, because the pieces matter in sequence." She opened the folder. Mason stood against the wall, arms loose at his sides, and watched her work. Outside the windows, Carrington Meridian Tower faced the city it had occupied for 40 years. The same city Arthur had watched from these same windows while building something he believed was worth protecting. The morning light was coming in flat and clear, the way it does at the beginning of days that aren't going to be simple. The board listened. The board session ran 2 hours and 14 minutes. Vivienne had asked for an hour. She got more than twice that because an hour was enough time to present the evidence, but not enough time for 15 people to work through the stages of processing information that dismantled something they'd believed in. There was the initial silence that followed her first document cluster, the silence of people absorbing a scale of wrongdoing they hadn't anticipated. Then came the questions, some sharp, some defensive, some that were really just the same question wearing different clothes. How did we not see this? Then the anger, which arrived in waves, some of it directed at Conrad, some of it directed at Warren, and a portion of it, the uncomfortable portion, the portion that spoke most honestly about the room, directed inward. Mason stood against the wall through all of it and said nothing unless directly asked, which happened twice. The first time, a board member named Hargrove, silver-haired, 60 years in finance, the kind of man who wore skepticism as a default setting, turned to look at him directly and said, "You're the driver." "I was the driver," Mason said. "Arthur brought you in." "Yes." Hargrove looked at him for a long moment. "He didn't tell the board." "No, he didn't trust the board, not all of it." Mason kept his voice even. He was right not to. 4 members of this board have financial relationships with the Whitmore Fund that created a conflict of interest in every governance vote for the past 3 years. Those connections are in the documents Ms. Carrington just presented. The 4 board members in question did not look at each other, which was its own kind of confirmation. The second time Mason was asked to speak directly, it was by Miriam Chen, who needed him to verbally confirm the chain of custody for the documents, where they'd been held, how they'd been maintained, whether they'd been altered. He answered each question cleanly and completely and returned to the wall. At 10:22, the board voted. Arthur's emergency proxy, activated through James Whitfield, neutralized the 4 compromised votes and shifted the balance decisively. Conrad's merger proposal was formally rejected. The fraudulent voting clause was voided. The succession provision invocation that Conrad had been building toward was blocked at the structural level before it could be filed. Vivienne remained CEO of Carrington Meridian Group by a margin that, once the proxy votes were counted, wasn't close. When Whitfield announced the final tally, the room was quiet for a moment. Not celebratory. The circumstances didn't allow for celebration yet, and the people in that room were experienced enough to know that the legal process ahead was going to be long and grinding and full of its own complications. But something settled. The held breath of an institution that had been tilting toward a cliff without knowing it finally found level ground again. Vivienne looked at Mason from across the table. He gave her a small nod. She looked away before her expression could do something she'd rather it didn't do in front of the board. Conrad Whitmore was formally arrested at 11:15 that morning. He was taken from the 19th floor conference room where he'd been held with federal investigators for the past several hours, walked through the building's service exit. Mason noted the choice of exit with something that wasn't quite satisfaction but was close to it, and placed in a vehicle that drove him away from Carrington Meridian Tower for the last time. Warren Slade had already been processed. He'd done what Patrick predicted, cooperated fully, provided account records, named intermediaries, delivered the kind of testimony that investigators called a gift and defense attorneys called a disaster. His cooperation would reduce his exposure. It would not eliminate it. He had helped engineer the conditions for an abduction attempt, and that was not a category of charge that cooperation made disappear. Mason learned these details from Patrick at noon, standing in the tower's lobby while the building resumed its ordinary Friday operations around them. Staff returning from lunch, the front desk handling normal inquiries, the particular determined normalcy of an organization that had been through something and was collectively deciding to keep going. Whitmore's attorneys are going to fight the account trace, Patrick said. The Cayman structure is layered. It'll take months to unwrap. But it unwraps. It unwraps. The Q3 transfer records you sent are the backbone of it. The originating account ties directly to the fund's management entity, not a subsidiary. That was a mistake on their part. They got overconfident somewhere. Patrick paused. Or they underestimated how thorough your documentation was. They underestimated the driver, Mason said. Patrick looked at him with the expression of someone who had known Mason long enough to hear exactly what was beneath that sentence and was choosing not to make a production of it. You should get some sleep, he said. I'm aware. Seriously, Mason, you look like something the tide brought in. I appreciate the imagery. They shook hands, and Patrick left, and Mason stood in the lobby for another minute looking at the building around him. The architecture of something Arthur Carrington had built over 40 years, which had almost been taken apart in a single night by people who understood its structure better than they understood its purpose. He thought about the old man in the Connecticut facility, the hawk eyes, the handwritten document that Whitfield had carried in a sealed envelope for 2 years. Arthur had built his insurance policy and never told his daughter about it because he'd wanted her to be strong enough not to need it. And then he'd made sure it existed anyway, because he was also honest enough to know that strength alone wasn't always enough. That was the kind of love that didn't announce itself, the kind that worked quietly in the background so that the person it was protecting never had to know how close the edge was. Mason understood that particular kind of love very well. He got home at 2 in the afternoon. Haley had made breakfast and then, when he hadn't come home by noon, transitioned it to lunch. Eggs that were slightly overdone because she'd been keeping them warm, toast that was fine, orange juice from the good oranges she knew he liked. She had set the table properly, which she only did when she was trying to make something feel normal when it wasn't. She looked at him when he came through the door and did the rapid assessment that children of complicated parents learn early, checking for injury, for the specific quality of his exhaustion, for whatever the night had left on his face. Then she went back to the kitchen without comment and brought the food to the table. They ate. For a while, neither of them said much. Mason ate more than he expected to. He hadn't realized how hungry he was until the food was in front of him. And Haley ate her own lunch and looked at him occasionally with the patient attention of someone giving a person space to arrive fully before demanding their presence. It's done, he said eventually. I know, it was on the news at noon. She picked up her juice. They didn't mention you. They wouldn't. I know they wouldn't. I'm just saying. She put her glass down. You look terrible, by the way. Everyone keeps saying that. Everyone is right. She looked at him across the table. Are you okay? Not tactically. Actually, okay. He thought about the question the way she'd asked it. Not the operational version, not the professional version. The actual one. I'm tired, he said, and I'm glad it's over. And I'm sitting at this table eating eggs that are a little overdone. They were perfect when I made them. And I'm glad to be here. He looked at her. Yeah, I'm okay. Haley considered this and apparently decided it was true enough. What happens now? Now I sleep for approximately a year. After that. He didn't have a complete answer for that yet, so he told her the honest version. I don't know exactly. There's going to be a legal process. I'll probably be called to testify at some point. The company is going to need to restructure its security from the ground up. He paused. Vivienne asked me to consider taking a role in that. Haley raised an eyebrow. Not the question version. The other one. The version that meant she was storing information to examine later. What kind of role? Running an independent security division, inside the company, but not reporting through the standard corporate chain. She was quiet for a moment. Would you still drive the car? No. Would you be home for dinner? Most nights. More than before, probably. She nodded slowly. Would you be good at it? He thought about Keen with the USB drive in her pocket for 2 hours, not knowing who to trust. Torres building his spreadsheet in his own time. Becker in the hallway at 3:45, hands visible, telling the truth. All those people in the tower who had known something was wrong and had no safe channel to say so. I think so, he said. There's a lot of fixing to do. Then you should probably do it, she said, with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who had known him long enough to know what he was like when he had work that mattered and what he was like when he didn't, and who strongly preferred the former. After you sleep. After I sleep, he agreed. He finished the overdone eggs and didn't mention them again, and Haley refilled his coffee without being asked. And outside the apartment window, the city continued doing what cities do. Indifferent, crowded, moving, carrying 10,000 ordinary Friday afternoons forward, simultaneously, while the extraordinary ones folded themselves into the past. The formal offer came 4 days later, on paper, delivered by Miriam Chen in a meeting that Vivienne also attended. It was comprehensive and specific in the way that Vivienne apparently did everything. The scope of the security division, the reporting structure, the operational independence, the resources. She had clearly thought about it more than the previous 4 days suggested, which meant she'd been thinking about it before the night of the gala, which meant some part of her had understood, before everything collapsed, that the security structure around her was broken in ways she hadn't fully examined. Mason read the document once quickly, and then again slowly, the way he read anything that mattered. There were 3 things he needed changed, and he said so directly. The division needs a formal independence guarantee, he said. Not just an organizational reporting line, a board-level charter provision that prohibits executive interference in active security investigations, including yours. Vivienne nodded. Done. Every employee in the company needs a protected internal channel for threat reporting, not through HR, not through the security division itself. A completely separate mechanism with external oversight. He paused. The people who helped us the other night, Keen, Torres, Becker, they all had information that could have shortened this by months. They didn't have anywhere safe to put it. I've already been thinking about that, she said. We were building a proposal before this happened, actually. It died in committee. She looked like she had opinions about that. It won't die in committee again. Third thing, Mason said. Go ahead. I need it written into the terms that I can leave, anytime my daughter needs me. No advance notice required, no approval process, no logging the reason. He held her gaze. That's not negotiable. Vivienne looked at him across the conference table. Something moved through her expression, not surprise exactly, more like recognition. That was your condition when Arthur recruited you too, wasn't it? More or less. He said yes. He said yes immediately, Mason said, which was part of why I trusted him. Vivienne picked up the document, made 3 handwritten notations in the margins, and initialed each one. She slid it back across the table. Welcome to Carrington Meridian, she said. Again. He signed it. The months that followed were not simple, because they never are after something like this. The federal investigation into Conrad Whitmore and the Whitmore Family Fund expanded in the way these investigations do, pulling in subsidiary structures, subsidiary people, months of financial forensics that Mason had no direct role in, but was occasionally called to support with testimony or documentation. He testified twice, once before a federal grand jury, and once in a deposition that lasted 6 hours and covered the full 18 months of his observations in exhausting detail. He answered every question completely and went home afterward and slept for 11 hours. Warren Slade pleaded guilty to 3 charges including conspiracy and obstruction. He received a sentence that his cooperation had reduced but not eliminated. Mason did not attend the hearing. He had no particular feeling about Warren's fate either way. The man had made his choices, and the consequences were proportionate, and that was as much of a conclusion as Mason needed. Conrad's case was slower and more complicated, as cases involving offshore financial structures and experienced corporate attorneys always are. By the time Mason's story ends here, it was still moving through the legal system, but moving with enough of the account documentation in federal hands that the destination wasn't in doubt, only the timeline. The 4 board members with Whitmore Fund connections resigned in the first 2 weeks, which Mason thought was probably the outcome they'd negotiated privately before the resignations became public. New board appointments were a process that Vivienne managed carefully, with Miriam's guidance, drawing candidates from a pool that Whitfield helped vet for conflict of interest entanglements. Hargrove stayed. Mason had expected that. The old silver-haired skeptic had spent the board session asking the hardest questions, but they'd been honest questions, the kind that came from wanting to understand rather than wanting to defend. By the second board session after the restructuring began, he'd become one of the most vocal proponents of the new security charter provision. He and Mason had a short, direct conversation in the tower lobby one morning that covered, in approximately 8 minutes, everything that needed to be covered between them, and after that they understood each other. Keene got a promotion. Torres was moved to a senior analyst position with direct reporting access that couldn't be filtered by department heads with interests in the numbers. Becker was the most complicated case. He'd been present at the garage, he'd known more than he admitted in his 345 confession, and the investigation had required him to testify about several specific conversations with Warren that he would clearly have preferred not to testify about. Mason gave no recommendation in either direction about Becker's future at the company. That was Vivienne's call, and she made it. Becker stayed, under a formal written agreement that documented exactly what had happened and what had been expected of him, because Vivienne had concluded that a person who eventually told the truth under pressure was more useful than a clean record that hid what someone would actually do when the pressure was real. Mason didn't agree with that decision, exactly. He also didn't disagree with it. He thought it was the decision of someone learning how to lead in the specific way that can't be taught, through consequences, through the necessary discomfort of choosing between imperfect options and then living with what you chose. He told her that once, not as a compliment, but as an observation, and she'd looked at him with an expression that was hard to read and said, "You could have led the division by being in the room when things were simple. You didn't. You stayed visible in the uncomfortable positions." A pause. That's not a coincidence. He hadn't had a response to that, which was unusual for him. The security division took shape over 3 months. It was not a smooth process, because building something from scratch inside an existing institution is never smooth. There were territorial frictions, budget negotiations, a particularly difficult 6 weeks when the division's independence charter language was being finalized, and 2 senior executives pushed back on provisions they felt limited their oversight authority, which was precisely the point of the provisions, and precisely why the pushback was predictable. Mason navigated it the way he navigated most things, by being clear about what he needed, flexible about how he got there, and completely immovable about the things that actually mattered. He hired 6 people in the first month. He put Keene on the internal threat reporting mechanism. She'd proven she understood the gap it was meant to fill, and she had the technical background to build the infrastructure. He brought in an external investigator named Dominguez from a firm he'd worked with on private contracts, who had the specific skill set of someone who could follow financial threads through corporate structures without getting lost in their complexity. He found a former federal prosecutor named Anaya, who had left the government side for reasons she was frank about. She'd been tired of cases dying for resource reasons, and she wanted to work somewhere the resources existed, and who became the division's legal interface with the regulatory process. The Protected Employee Reporting Channel went live in the 8th week. In the first month, it received 43 submissions. Most were minor. Interpersonal conflicts, policy concerns, things that needed attention but weren't crises. 6 were serious enough to investigate. 2 of those led to personnel actions. Mason presented every outcome to Vivienne in a written report without editorializing, and she read them without flinching, and the reports continued monthly after that without either of them making a ceremony of it. It was, Mason thought, what good institutional hygiene looked like. Unglamorous, repetitive, occasionally uncomfortable, and absolutely necessary. The moment he understood that something between him and Vivienne had shifted, not dramatically, not with announcement, but genuinely, happened on an ordinary Wednesday evening in the 5th month. He was leaving the tower at 6:30, which was late for him because he'd learned to protect his evenings for Haley. But a division review had run long and there had been a deposition preparation call at 5 that couldn't move. I was in the elevator heading to the lobby when the doors opened at the 24th floor and Vivienne stepped in. She looked the way she looked at 6:30 on ordinary Wednesdays. Not the gala armor, not the board session composure, just a person who had been working all day and was aware of it. She had a coat over her arm and a bag over one shoulder, and she was looking at her phone as she stepped in. And when she looked up and saw him, she didn't perform a reaction. She just said, "Hey," the way you say it to someone you see often enough that their presence doesn't require adjustment. "Hey," he said. The elevator descended. She put her phone in her bag. "How was the deposition prep?" she asked. "Long. Dominguez found 2 additional account transfers in the Q2 records that the prosecution hadn't flagged. It changes the timeline slightly." "Changes it how?" "Add 6 weeks to the fund's documented operational period, which means the pattern of manipulation started earlier than they initially charged, which strengthens the case." He paused. "It's a good find." The prosecutors were pleased. She nodded. They stood in the elevator in the comfortable quiet of 2 people who had shared enough difficult hours that silence wasn't awkward between them. The lobby floor arrived, the doors opened. They walked out together into the lobby, and then to the main entrance, and then out onto the street where the city evening was happening. Taxis and pedestrians, and the particular urban October light that made everything look slightly more significant than it was. They stopped on the sidewalk. "I'm heading to the parking garage," she said. "I'm heading to the subway," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Not the professional look, not the calculating one. The one he'd seen first at 2 in the morning in his workshop when she'd been wearing his clothes and looking at a table full of documents that explained why her company had almost been taken from her. The one where the armor was down and she was just herself. "Mason," she said, "are you happy? Here, in this role?" He thought about the question seriously, because she'd asked it seriously. "I'm useful," he said, "and I'm home for dinner most nights." He paused. "Yeah, I think I am." She looked at him a beat longer. "Good," she said. And then, with something that was not quite casual but was trying to be, "Tell Haley I said hi." "She'll ask how I know you," he said. "She's been curious." "Then maybe she should come to the tower sometime, see where her father works." "She'd enjoy that," he said. "She has opinions about corporate architecture." Vivienne smiled. Not the professional one, not the event one. The small, surprised, genuine one that she still seemed slightly unprepared for when it arrived. "Of course she does." They said goodnight, and Mason walked to the subway, and he thought about what happiness actually looked like when it wasn't the cinematic version. It looked like useful work and dinner at home and a kid who set the table when she was worried about you. It looked like a building that was slightly safer than it had been, and people who finally had somewhere to put what they knew. It looked like 6:30 on an ordinary Wednesday when the thing you'd spent a year and a half afraid of had been stopped and the long process of repairing what it damaged was happening, imperfectly, the way repair always happens. It wasn't a moment, it was an accumulation. Well, 3 weeks later on a Saturday, Haley came to Carrington Meridian Tower. Mason had arranged it as a practical matter. He needed to retrieve some files and do a walkthrough of the new reporting system interface that Keen's team had finished building. And Haley had been asking to see where he worked since the story became public enough that her school friends had started asking her about it. He'd put it off because the building was still in the middle of its restructuring and he hadn't wanted to make it into something ceremonial. But Haley was 17 and persistent in the specific way of people who know how to wait and then show up anyway, so he brought her on a Saturday when the building was quiet. Vivienne was there. This was not technically planned. Vivienne worked Saturdays with some regularity, a habit Mason had observed over 18 months and attempted without success to argue her out of. But he was not entirely surprised either. When they came off the elevator on the 24th floor, Vivienne was in her office with the door open, in weekend clothes, reading something. She looked up when she heard them. Haley stopped walking. She looked at Vivienne, then at her father, then back at Vivienne with the particular perceptiveness of a 17-year-old who has been raised by a person who notices things and has therefore learned to notice things herself. "You're her," Haley said. Vivienne stepped out into the corridor. "Vivienne Carrington, you must be Haley." "Yeah." Haley looked at her father briefly, with an expression that was hard to interpret and which Mason suspected contained more than one layer. "He talks about you sometimes. The work stuff." "He talks about you constantly," Vivienne said. "Not work stuff." Haley absorbed this. "He doesn't talk constantly," she said. "He barely talks." "You're right. He mentioned you constantly by the standards of someone who barely talks, which made it even more noticeable." She paused. "He's proud of you." Haley looked at her father. He had been watching this exchange with the expression of a man slightly outside his area of expertise. "Dad, she's normal." "I know she's normal." "I mean," Haley gestured vaguely, "you made her sound so, I don't know, complicated." "I said the situation was complicated," Mason said, "which it was." "She's a person," Haley said with 17-year-old definitiveness. "That's possibly the most accurate summary of me anyone has produced," Vivienne said. Haley considered her for another moment and then turned and walked toward the window at the end of the corridor to look at the view, in the way of someone who has gathered enough information and needs a moment to process it. Vivienne looked at Mason. He looked back at her. There was something passing between them that had no clean name, acknowledgement, maybe, of a thing that had been accumulating over months without being declared. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. Haley turned from the window. "Can I see the reporting system?" she said to no one in particular. "The thing Keene built. Dad says it's interesting." "I'll show you," Vivienne said. They walked down the corridor together, and Mason followed behind them, and he listened to Haley ask questions. Real questions, specific questions, the kind that required actual answers, and listened to Vivienne answer them in full, not performing for a teenager but actually engaging, and thought about how Arthur Carrington had understood something that most people took years to see, that the real threats to the things you've built rarely announce themselves. They use the access you've already given them. They wear the titles you've already trusted. And the people who see them coming are almost never the ones you'd expect, because visibility is its own kind of blindness. You stop looking at what's right in front of you because you've already decided what it is. A driver. A single father. The quiet man in the front seat. The problem with deciding what something is before you've looked carefully is that you don't get to correct the mistake until it's almost too late. Arthur had known that. He'd built his insurance policy around it. And he'd chosen Mason specifically because a man that nobody looked at twice would have the access, the time, and the cover to see what needed to be seen. But there was something Arthur hadn't fully anticipated, and Mason thought about it sometimes on the ordinary mornings when he drove himself to the tower in his own car and walked through the lobby as something other than the driver. What the old man hadn't accounted for was that being invisible for 18 months teaches you something about the people around you that visibility never can. You hear the conversations that stop when important people enter the room. You see the decisions people make when they think nobody's watching. You understand who people actually are rather than who they've decided to perform. And what Mason had seen from the front seat of an armored Cadillac over 18 months was a company full of imperfect people trying to do work that mattered. A CEO who was learning how to be the leader she needed to be. Employees who knew what was right and needed someone to make it safe to say so. An old man who loved his daughter enough to build a safety net she'd never know about. He'd seen all of that. He'd been paying attention. 6 months after the gala, Mason sat in the tower's lobby cafe at 7:15 in the morning, finishing his coffee before the day started. His notebook was on the table. The same worn spiral notebook from the front seat of the Escalade, now nearly full, which he'd been using to log the new division's operational observations with the same methodical care he'd used for everything else. Haley called at 7:20. "You're at work early," she said. "I'm always at work early." "Yeah, but you're not driving anybody. You could sleep in." "I could," he agreed. "I don't." She made the sound that meant she was rolling her eyes. "Are you coming to the thing Thursday night?" The thing on Thursday was her school's annual academic showcase, a presentation night where seniors displayed their research projects. Haley had spent 2 months on a project that she'd described to him only in broad strokes, which meant she was either uncertain about it or she was planning a surprise, and she was not generally an uncertain person. "I'll be there," he said. "You'll definitely be there." "Haley," I'll be there. Okay, good. A pause. Is she, would it be weird if you can invite whoever you want, he said. I'm just asking. I know you're just asking. A longer pause. She's good for you, Haley said, with the directness that meant she'd been thinking about it for a while and had decided to say it. Not because of the job stuff, just, you're different. You talk more. You seem like you're actually in the room instead of monitoring it. Mason was quiet for a moment. She's a good person, he said. I know she is. That's what I said. Haley's voice had the tone of someone being patient with someone who is being deliberately obtuse. You're allowed to have a life, Dad, not just a duty. He didn't answer immediately, which she accepted, because she knew him well enough to know that the things he didn't answer immediately were the ones he was taking seriously. Thursday, he said. 7 o'clock. I'll be in the front row. Second row, she said. Front row is embarrassing. Second row, he agreed. He hung up and sat with his coffee and looked at the lobby around him. The ordinary 8 a.m., beginning of an ordinary workday in a building that was putting itself back together, staffed by people who were trying to do their jobs well in the imperfect way that real people do real jobs, carrying the ordinary mixture of dedication and distraction and ambition and fatigue that made institutions human. He'd spent 11 years in a world where the mission was everything, and the people were instruments of it. He'd spent 1 year running invisible through the margins of someone else's crisis. And he'd arrived here, at a lobby table with a coffee and a notebook and a Thursday night in the second row at his daughter's school, not because the crises were over, but because he'd decided, years ago on a night when everything changed, that a life was not the same thing as a mission, and that the people in it were not the same thing as assets to protect. Haley had been 8 years old when her mother died, and she'd grown up watching her father navigate the distance between those two things, the mission version of himself and the actual version, with varying success and complete commitment. She'd grown up knowing he wasn't perfect at it. She'd grown up loving him anyway. That was the thing about being seen clearly by someone who knew you. It didn't require you to be perfect. It just required you to keep showing up. Mason finished his coffee, closed his notebook, and went upstairs to work. The building held its ordinary morning around him. The lobby filled with people coming in from the cold. The elevators ran. The city outside moved the way cities move, forward, indifferent, full of stories happening simultaneously in 1,000 directions, most of them quiet, most of them carried by people that nobody looked at twice. Most of the important